Okay, good day, everyone. And on behalf of the Planck Center for Leadership and Public Relations, I want to thank you for electing to join this session. And because you made that choice, I suspect you've got a concern about the impact of disinformation on the way our world is working today. So do we, and that's why we're here. So my name is Mark Harris. I'm a member of the Board of Advisors at the Planck Center. Before I get to more complete introductions of our two subject matter experts, Elisa Shearer from the Pew Research Center and Alan Miller, the founder of the News Literacy Project, let me take just a minute to frame the why. Why this topic, and why this topic for people in public relations and communications roles. The answer is really our belief that among all of the major threats to the operations of a healthy society, climate change, the pandemic, this one, the creation, the design, the dissemination of content, and I will not call it information, that is intentionally distributed with an attempt to mislead or inflame or create suspicion or divide us. That has to make the list of the major threats to the way our world works today. So there's that, and our belief that people in communications have a responsibility here. We have a role in helping the people that work with us discriminate, differentiate valid information from what is bogus information. We have a responsibility to help the leaders that we support and the brands we represent take an active role in restoring people's ability to trust what they see and hear. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And to lead that conversation, I'm joined by two true subject matter experts. First, Elisa Shearer from the Pew Research Center. I think everyone knows the Pew Research Center is one of the world's leading authorities on public opinion polling. They are also a global leader on this issue of misinformation. And Elisa is a primary researcher and author of Pew's American News Pathways Project, which examines the relationship between news sources and how the source influences individuals' perceptions and beliefs. And then Alan Miller, CEO and founder of the News Literacy Project. And if you're not familiar with them at the moment, this is a nonpartisan, nonprofit that is dedicated to combating misinformation by promoting news literacy and information literacy. So this is a work that Alan started after a long and very distinguished career in journalism, most of it at the LA Times, where among other things, he won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. So thank you both for being with us in this audience today, and let's get into it. And I think, Elisa, I'd like to start with some data, your research, and maybe we can establish some baselines and definitions, because something I call disinformation, somebody else is looking at as the essential facts of their worldview. I mean, how are we to understand this? What does the data tell us?
Thanks, Mark. In the realm of public opinion, we've seen for a couple of years now that Americans are very concerned about misinformation. So in a 2019 study, they ranked it above racism, illegal immigration, and terrorism as a very big problem for the country. Wow. More recently, 49% think that misinformation leaves Americans very confused about the coronavirus. And on the political side, after the 2020 election, 60% said it had a major impact on the outcome of the election. And also during that election, 72% said that they had seen at least some election news that seemed completely made up. So there's definitely a high level of concern about misinformation. That concern is generally bipartisan, and we've seen it very high now for a few years. 54% also say that they think that misinformation has a big impact on Americans' confidence in each other, looking at kind of the more long-term view. And 68%, so even more, say they think it has a big impact on Americans' confidence in government. And again, that data was collected in 2019, so that's been true for a few years now. Talking about the definition of misinformation, there's in some research, we distinguish between misinformation as a kind of blanket term about all information that isn't true, and some researchers kind of specify disinformation as specifically having been created with the intent to mislead. From a public opinion standpoint, we find that Americans think about misinformation a lot of different ways, and their previous opinions and personal identity and political identity impacts how they're thinking about misinformation. So that's definitely one of the issues that we're parsing through as public opinion researchers.
Hey, Ellen, could you pick up on that and maybe just give us your sense of, from your work, the depth of the threat that we're facing and maybe the consequences if we don't get on top of this?
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you. The concerns that Elisa's research have demonstrated reflect are well-founded. Misinformation now presents an existential threat to not only the country's public life, but to its public health. The country is deeply divided by hyperpartisanship and tribalism that is driven by the news and information that people consume and share and act on. In just 4 years, we've seen the country go from alternative facts to alternative realities. The past year in particular has seen conspiratorial thinking move from the fever swamps of the internet onto the streets and into the US Capitol and the halls of Congress. It's really been, in the last year, a perfect storm in terms of misinformation, whether we're looking at the pandemic and everything associated from its source to its scale, to possible anecdotes, to possible solutions, to the vaccines, to the rise of QAnon as a threat, domestic terrorist threat driven by conspiratorial thinking, to the pre-election disinformation and post-election denialism. America has now supplanted Russia and China as the misinformation powerhouse of the world, and incredibly, we're at a point where it is uncertain that we're going to continue to have a fact-based reality. And ultimately, facts matter. I mean, they are the basis for what we teach in our schools, for our scientific research and discoveries, and for our effective public policy discussions, debates, and solutions. And if facts are in trouble, so is our democracy.
Very well said. I think we've established the depth and the severity of the issue that we're talking about. Thank you both for that. Alan, let me come back to you. And what we're talking about is disinformation, misinformation, content that, and a lot of it like really precisely targeted at individuals that will be highly susceptible to a specific kind of message. So I'm wondering just how your work helps people differentiate and discern what's got integrity and what's just bogus or malicious.
So, Mark, as you mentioned, I founded the News Literacy Project in 2008. And for our first 12 years or so, we were focused primarily on middle and high school students. That's still our primary focus, but we're now looking to help the general public as well, because misinformation is a challenge for all generations. And so what we do is we create programs and resources to help people determine what news and information to trust, and to give them the tools to be informed and engaged participants in democracy. And we also instill an appreciation of the role of the First Amendment and the free press. So what we encourage people to do is to become more mindful and savvy consumers, to ask themselves about anything that they encounter. Should I trust this? Should I share this? Should I act on it? And it starts with asking, what am I looking at? Am I looking, because so much is disaggregated and coming through social media feeds, am I looking at something that is news and intends to inform in a dispassionate, contextual, accurate, and fair way? Or is it something that's intended to persuade, or to sell, or to mislead, or to misinform? What are the sources? Who created it? Can you tell who created it? Where did it come from? Is it from a reputable source? What are the sources that are cited in the information? What is the documentation? Are you being provided enough information to make up your own mind, or is it something that seeks to clearly persuade you or inflame you? Is there bias in it? What are your own biases that you bring to it? And then to look, are others reporting on it? Are there other places you can find it? To look for the comments on it. And then particularly, if it's something that engages your emotions, if it's something that makes you angry or anxious or even joyful, you should step back and be particularly skeptical, because that's when the thinking part of our brain tends to shut down, the emotional part kicks in, and we're much more susceptible to being misinformed, or misled. And so, ultimately to bring that critical thinking to whatever you encounter, and then apply it, and particularly to ask yourself if it's something that's responsible to share, because the sharing is a big part of the spread of virality and misinformation.
Terrific. Elisa, anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, thinking about who is most susceptible to misinformation and what groups we see it kind of resonating amongst. I have a couple of slides here to show some data. Now, this is all data from the American News Pathways Project, which was a project that we conducted over the course of mostly the year of 2020, looking at how the ways that people see and view the world, how they're connected to the news sources and those other sources of information that they're going to. So this first slide is looking at trust in the CDC. We asked people whether they thought the CDC, specifically about the coronavirus, was getting the facts right, CDC and other public health orgs. And on questions like this, throughout the project, we saw a lot of party divides. And that was sort of initially part of the project. We knew that we're going to see party divides on the election, and we eventually saw them on the coronavirus pandemic, but we really wanted to dig under the hood of those party divides and look within party, depending on where people were getting their information. So this slide is showing that among Republicans overall were less likely to say that the CDC was getting the facts right compared with Democrats. But when we looked within the Republican Party, Republicans who were turning to Trump and the coronavirus task force for news, that's that top bar, were even less likely to say that the CDC was getting the facts right. And Republicans who were turning to another source for most of their coronavirus news were more likely to say that the CDC was getting the facts right. You can go to the next slide. So we saw this again when it came to news and information about the election. In this case, we looked at Republicans who were turning to the Trump campaign as a major source of their election news and Republicans who weren't. So this is another question where we saw a big party divide. Not really a huge surprise that voter fraud is a major problem when it comes to voting by mail. This was asked in September of 2020. And respondents could say it was a major problem, a minor problem, or not a problem at all. Republicans overall were a lot more likely than Democrats to say that voter fraud was a major problem. But again, when you look by what source of information they were going to, Republicans who were turning to the Trump campaign as a major source of election news were a lot more likely to say that voter fraud is a major problem than Republicans who weren't turning to the Trump campaign. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Colleen. Another thing this project looked at, we didn't want to just look at political actors as sources of news. We wanted also to look at news organizations, since that's where a lot of people get their news and information. And we compared people's news diets with how much they had heard or believed in different strains of unproven claims, specifically about the coronavirus. So this graphic, we asked about 30 news sources. This graphic, I want to walk you through it a little bit, has a lot of numbers on it. But the top half shows the Republican Party, the top 3 rows, and the bottom 3 rows show the Democratic Party. So that's kind of the top and the bottom half. And then we looked at news outlets and we organized them based on what their audience ideology was. So outlets with mostly a right-leaning audience, outlets with mostly a left-leaning audience, and outlets with a mixed audience. And that's kind of how we sorted people based on their media diet. So at the very top row here, we have Republicans who are only turning to outlets with a right-leaning audience. And the 4th row down, right underneath the Dem label, that shows kind of the reverse among Democrats who are only turning to outlets with a left-leaning audience. So you have these partisans who are kind of turning only to outlets with like-minded audiences. And that's where we see the biggest differences. And those are the groups that we see differ from the rest of their party. So in this question, this was asked very early in March 2020, March 10th through the 16th. So this was really early on in the coronavirus pandemic. We asked people if they thought it was most likely that the virus came about naturally, developed either intentionally or accidentally in a laboratory, or if they weren't sure. And you can see this top row, Republicans who were only turning to those outlets with right-leaning audiences were a lot more likely to say that the virus was developed intentionally in a lab. That was actually the most common answer that people gave us, this group gave us. And they were a lot more likely to think that than other Republicans who were turning to also outlets with a mixed audience or a left-leaning audience or another mix of outlets. So this is another question that we kind of initially saw, that party break, but then when you look under the hood of that, there's a lot of differences in how these partisans are looking at the world that's connected to where they're getting their news and information. We can go to the next slide. This is a similar question, similar break. The top half shows Republicans, bottom half shows Democrats, and this top row, it's a similar methodology. This time we're only looking at Republicans who are turning to Fox News or talk radio. Those were the outlets in this part of the study that had right-leaning audiences. And this question is asking whether people think that people under 18 are more susceptible or less susceptible than adults to becoming infected with the coronavirus. So disregarding how severe their symptoms are, just whether they're susceptible to becoming infected. And Republicans who are only turning to Fox News or talk radio were a lot more likely to say that young people, more than half of them said that young people under 18 were far less susceptible than other adults to becoming infected with the coronavirus. You can go to the next slide, Colleen. Thank you. Another part of the study that we looked at, kind of apart from party breaks that we usually see, is we looked at the different pathways that people turn to news. So regardless of the source, kind of, are you watching local TV or cable television or radio or using a print newspaper or social media, because we know that social media comes up a lot in these conversations about misinformation. So this graphic kind of breaks up Americans based on what pathways they're most likely to use for their political news. And this is another question where we looked at different unproven claims about the coronavirus. In this case, we did see a few of the unproven claims about the coronavirus popping up more, or being more aware. People who were getting most of their news on social media were more aware of them, but it wasn't true for all of the claims. But the two shown here, vitamin C, the idea that vitamin C could be used to prevent getting coronavirus, and the fact that there might be a connection between 5G and the virus. This is in April of 2020, so kind of think about that period of time. We saw that folks who were turning to social media were a lot more likely to have heard a lot about each of those claims. However, it was interesting because there were a couple of other claims. For example, the idea that hydroxychloroquine was kind of a miracle cure. We asked about that as well. And people turning to social media were no more likely than others to have heard about that claim. So there's a couple of things going on. If you think about the previous slides, there's partisanship and engagement connected to who is believing and hearing about these claims, and also the pathways that people are turning to. So one of the interesting things about social media folks is that they tend to be a little less engaged and they tend to follow the news less overall. So in some cases, we saw that people who are only turning to social media or mostly turning to social media actually hadn't heard these claims because they weren't following the topics that closely. That's it. Thanks, Colleen. So
let me stay with that for a second, Elisa. It's like there's a lot of provocative data there. What does your data tell us about who people blame for the situation that we find ourselves in? And so who's to blame? And if they have a concern, who do they think is in a position to do something about it?
Yeah, so we actually asked this question, a question about this a few years ago, and there's kind of an interesting paradox that comes up in the realm of public opinion. When we asked people who they thought was most responsible for creating misinformation, politicians and their staff and activist groups came up at the top. So about half or a little more than half of Americans said that they thought each of those groups created a lot of misinformation. News organizations, actually, I think in that question, it was journalists was the question wording. About a third of Americans said that they thought journalists create a lot of misinformation, and below that was the public. So when we asked who's creating it, politicians and activist groups came out at the top. However, we asked then who Americans thought had the most responsibility for reducing misinformation. And in that case, the news media bore the brunt of the responsibility in their responses. So 53% of Americans said that the news media was the most responsible had the most responsibility to reduce misinformation. The next most common response was 20% said the public, The government was underneath that, and I think just 9% said tech companies were the most responsible for reducing it. So there's an imbalance in who people think is creating it versus who they think has the most responsibility to reduce misinformation.
So Alan, what's your take? I mean, what's, what you've been living with this for quite some time now. What's your thought on who's got the leverage? Let's focus on correction. Who's got the leverage to actually do something to get this back on track? And let's just go with that. Just, does your work suggest that people believe that, there are entities, government, media, business that have more wherewithal here to address the issue?
So, just as there's no one source of this sweeping challenge, there's no one entity, obviously, that can resolve it. I mean, there's no silver bullet or panacea here. I would start with the social media companies, since, that's where people are getting so much of this misinformation, disinformation. They have community standards that they need to enforce consistently and effectively to remove hate speech that threatens violence, that undermines democratic norms, and that undermines public health. And not only the posts, but the individuals who are posting. They've been doing a lot more of that of late, but they haven't done that consistently, throughout. I think there's a role for government to more effectively and smartly regulate those platforms on the tech companies. Clearly, the news media has responsibility. I would say that journalists should double down on accuracy and verification and fairness, on separating news and opinion, clearly labeling them, on being transparent about what they know and when they know it and how they know it and what they don't know, being accountable when mistakes are made, to quickly acknowledge and correct them, and to ensure that there's more diversity and inclusion in their newsrooms and in their coverage and in the sources that they are quoting and using. I think there's a big role here for education. I believe that news literacy, the ability to discern credible information, is an essential life skill in an information age, and that every state should adopt standards, whether it's in civics or through media literacy, that require it to be taught and tested to give students an opportunity, not only in their schoolwork and their day-to-day life, but really to give them the skills to be informed and engaged participants in the country's public life. And then I think to go back to Elisa's very interesting research, there's a big public responsibility here. I mean, what we see there is that people are now so ensconced in their filter bubbles, they're virtually filter prisons. And that people very frequently seek not information from news that they're consuming, but confirmation of their existing belief. And I firmly believe that the more we see our news through prisms of red and blue, the more we tend to see the world in terms that are black and white. So I think that we need to see a sea change, Mark, in its public responsibility and habits about how we consume and share news. That every one of us needs to become more mindful about what it is that we're seeing and what we do with it. And to say that I'm not going to be part of the misinformation problem, I'm going to be part of an information solution. That misinformation stops with me. And I think what we need to see ultimately in the public is the kind of thing that we've seen with issues like smoking and drunk driving and littering. And the difference is it took a long time for those changes to happen, and we don't have a long time with the misinformation threat. We had a stress test for American democracy quite recently. Fortunately, it survived, barely. And my concern is that if we don't tackle this challenge head on, that we may not be so fortunate next time.
Well, I mean, I just, a couple of the headlines that jumped out of that for me. I mean, the idea of embedding this in the American education system as a skill that can be acquired, it can be taught, it can be developed. I mean, I think that's a very big idea. I wanted to ask you if you could just continue for a second and maybe extend that idea about education to anything that you would recommend specific to people in communications roles, and in the context of how do we promote good information habits in the enterprises where we work, and how do we advise the senior leaders that we're working with about their responsibilities in helping restore trust in information?
So I think communications professionals are incredibly well positioned and no doubt well equipped to play an important role here. I would say, first of all, to become more news literate yourselves, to learn about the tools and resources that are available, and then to really become champions of this effort, first of all, within your companies, within your networks, with your clients, with journalists and the public that you're engaged with, because you can play a really important role in amplifying this. And I would very much invite all of the guests to get engaged with us. We are the leader in the field that I helped to found. We have a big vision. We want to see news literacy embedded in the American educational experience and a more news literate America, but we can't do it ourselves. We need partners, and we need patrons, and we need other participants to help us. So I would say, first of all, become familiar with our resources, share them with your networks, with educators follow us on social media and help amplify our posts and our messaging there. Let educators know to use them. And we certainly speak to journalists who you're working with about possibly doing stories on news literacy or NLP or the field. And then we certainly welcome donations to help us build our capacity, impact, and reach, or introductions to foundations or corporations or your corporate social responsibility programs. And if you're further interested and want to connect with me, you can reach me at amiller@newslit.org, and I'm happy to talk with you about the role you might play.
Awesome. Terrific offer. I hope we've got a lot of people in the audience today to take you up on that. Elisa, let me come back to you and ask you just sort of like, what is, we're an audience. The audience you're addressing now are people that have to understand other audiences. So speaking to that part of what we do for a living, what can you tell us about who is consuming the most misinformation? And I'm curious, is there any political affiliations that you can correlate to the answer to that?
Yeah, who is consuming the most is a question that we're always looking to answer. And one of Alan's points really struck me when he said that it has a lot to do with what your previously held opinions are. That has a lot to do with the misinformation that you tend to be drawn towards. And what we found in our research over the past year is that misinformation is often in the eye of the beholder, and it's also highly motivated by political identity and previously held opinions. Even people's image of what misinformation will be, we know that there's bipartisan concern about misinformation. Before the election, there was bipartisan concern that misinformation would have an impact on the election. But we also asked people which party they thought that misinformation would be intended to hurt, and Democrats were more likely to say the Democratic Party, and Republicans were more likely to say it would be intended to hurt the Republican Party. So everyone is perceiving this as a threat, but depending on what your previously held opinions are, where that threat is coming from, and who it's going to hurt varies greatly. On the COVID side, we asked people who said that they had seen what they thought was misinformation about the coronavirus to provide us with examples of what that misinformation might be. And responses really ran the gamut from actual conspiracy theories to facts that are could subjectively be considered true, like the virus is a big deal. People thought that was misinformation. And then we also had responses that were really partisanly driven. So everything that Trump says is misinformation. Some people said everything the Democrats say is misinformation, other people said. So respondents really seem to be responding to facts that didn't agree with their worldview and thinking that that was misinformation, and that's what they're concerned about. So public opinion research on this has a lot to parse through. And the data are really interesting, but I think Alan's point that it has a lot to do with people's preconceived opinions. But also in the data that I showed before, we saw that strains of misinformation are often more believed by people who are turning to news sources with like-minded audiences. So these people also, they tend to be more partisan, we know that, but they also tend to be more engaged. And in a lot of ways, they're more knowledgeable. Highly engaged partisans are more knowledgeable on like generic political questions, and they're following the news more closely. So it's not just kind of low information folks who are believing misinformation. It's not just people who are logging on a little bit and seeing something and believing it. There seems to be a lot of partisan identity and preconceived notions that are behind people kind of grasping onto these ideas and holding on to them.
Yeah, it's like coming back to something Alan said a couple of minutes ago. It's like, regardless of where you sit, people are no longer seeking information, they're seeking confirmation, right? If you didn't know what confirmation bias was 18 months ago, everybody understands the concept now. Alan, I probably should have done this during your discussion a couple of minutes ago, but could you take a minute and help our audience understand some of just the tactical and specific resources that your organization develops that we could apply in our roles as communicators?
Sure. And one point I'll make, I touched on earlier, is that, we for many years were focused solely on middle and high school students because we wanted to reach the next generation when they were forming habits of mind and consumption habits that would last a lifetime. But last year we recognized we couldn't wait. The problem was so urgent. So we created resources for the general public as well that we launched last year. So our primary tool in the classroom, and now for the public as well, is Checkology, which is our virtual classroom. And it's a cutting edge, highly engaging online platform with real world lessons led by a dynamic and diverse group of journalists and experts on the First Amendment and digital media. And it gives a grounding on how to discern different kinds of news and information, on the watchdog role of journalism, on the role of algorithms, on misinformation. We have a brand new lesson on conspiratorial thinking that's very timely. And there's a version of that for the general public. We have a weekly newsletter called The Sift, which takes the latest viral rumors, conspiracy theories, and hoaxes and turns them into lessons with prompts for educators. We have a version of that for the general public called Get Smart About News, which comes out every week. All of our resources are available for free, by the way. We have an app called Informable, which is a news literacy game that tests and builds skills so you can level up, again, for all ages. We have a podcast now called Is That a Fact? That looks at the role of misinformation and democracy. And we also have other quizzes and tools on our website at newslit.org. And Checkology is available at checkology.org. So I encourage people as well to follow us on social media, to follow me on Twitter, Alan Miller NLP, and to both use and share all of our resources widely.
Thank you. And I just personally, the part of the SIFT updates that goes through specific bits of news and then examines whether they are valid, invalid, and why. That, I mean, if you're looking for a place to start, and I'm speaking to the audience now, start with that, because that is like super useful, super practical. And I would just say that the Planks biweekly newsletter, we are going to begin to start linking in every issue to a lot of the resources that Alan just mentioned.
That's great, Mark. I've always felt that the viral rumors and conspiracy theories that we debunk in the SIFT and now Get Smart About News, they are the stuff of online conversation, of water cooler conversation when we can go back to it, or online water cooler conversation and dinner time conversation. They are so timely and topical and I think incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. So I think this is one of the most important conversations that anybody, but very specifically people in communications and public relations roles, can be having today. I am sensing that I wish we had allocated more time for this. Let me ask at this point if I could just get a summary final thought from each one of you, and maybe Elisa, you could start us off.
Sure. I would say in the few years that we've been studying misinformation, we found that it impacts a lot of different aspects of life in America, and concern about it is very high and ranges from people's perceptions about current events to something as basic as their trust in government and their trust in each other. And it's really wrapped up in social and political identity.
Alan?
We all need to join forces to combat this rising tide of toxic misinformation. So help us turn our mission into a movement and to ensure a future founded on facts. Thank you.
Okay. Needs to be a movement, needs to be a mission, it needs to be pervasive. We've all got a stake in it. It's that simple. All right, look, as we wrap up now, I'd like to once again show you some of our audience, some of the resources that are available, both from the News Literacy Project and also how you would get to the content and the analysis and data from the Pew Research Center.
Yeah, Mark, people can go find all of our research on our website at pewresearch.org. We have a misinformation topic page specifically where you can find all of our research on misinformation. But even more broadly, every topic that we study in public opinion, we're looking at studying how Americans view their reality and view their world. So I hope people find it useful.
Thank you. I'm sure they will. Okay, so again, okay, now we're wrapping up then. First, Alan and Elisa, thank you both for giving us your time, giving us your expertise, and bringing your perspectives to this audience. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that the Planck Center wants to be part of. So for those of you that are viewing, if you found it valuable, mention it to your colleagues. Share the link. Stay tuned, stay with us, and thank you all very much.